All right, we are reading Nate Saint on a Wing and a Prayer by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are on chapter 4, titled An Unacceptable Risk. All right. Nate received a fast reply from Christian Airmen's Missionary Fellowship. Betty Green wrote about CAMF's plans to begin work in South America. CAMF's first goal was to help Wycliffe Bible translators set up some jungle stations in southern Mexico and then do the same in Peru. Betty Green suggested that when the war was over, Nate join her in Peru and become the ministry's mechanic. Nate thought and prayed long and hard about her offer. Meanwhile, Army life continued as usual. There were new challenges and new locations. For a while, Nate briefed crews going into combat overseas. He loved the job. It gave him regular hours and an office of his own. Best of all, though, he got Sundays off, and every Sunday Nate would be in church, usually with a few fellow soldiers he'd brought along with him. On June 19, 1945, after 18 months stationed at Bear Field, Nate was transferred to an air base near Salinas, California. Shortly afterwards, he was transferred yet again, this time to Castle Field in Merced, California. Soon after Nate arrived in Merced, in August, the Japanese surrendered to the United States. World War II was over, the war effort began to wind down, and everyone stationed at the base had more time on their hands. Nate used the extra time to tell others about the gospel message. He invited friends to church with him and began holding a regular Bible study on the base. As a result of the Bible study and the example of his life, many men became committed Christians. While stationed at Merced, Nate continued to think and pray about the offer from Betty Green. In the end, though, he felt he should go to Bible college first and get some theological training. Reluctantly, he wrote to Betty Green and turned down her offer for now. About this time, Nate was also thinking about Marjorie Ferris, a friend of a friend. Marge, as she liked to be called, was training to be a nurse in Los Angeles. She was about 5'2", with short, wavy brown hair and sparkling blue eyes. Nate had met her only a few times, but there was something about her faith and the way she cared for those around her that attracted him. Marge lived in a flurry of activity, always visiting friends, volunteering her spare time to sit with ill patients, and leading Sunday school at a local church. Despite all her activity, there was a peace about Marge. She was never in a hurry and somehow always had enough time to make everyone she met feel special. Nate would have liked to spend more time with her, but Merced was 300 miles from Los Angeles, and he expected to be sent home soon to Huntington, Pennsylvania for good. Men were being discharged from the Army and shipped home every week from Castle Field. Nate waited impatiently for his discharge papers to arrive. After nearly 3 years in the Army, he was tired of the routine of military life and the lack of privacy that came with it. As he waited, he came up with the idea of using his remaining leave time to go camping at Yosemite National Park. There, he could get away from everything and be alone with nature. Nate had no idea just how alone he would end up being. Nate set out for Yosemite with 2 Army buddies. It was mid-December, and when they arrived, the park was nearly empty. The following morning, as the 3 men looked out the tent door, they knew why the park was deserted. It was not normal camping weather. Thick, damp fog had closed in all around them, blanketing them in gray silence. It was hardly the start of a trip they'd imagined, but Nate was eager to do something. He wanted to hike the trail up to Glacier Point. The trail was several miles long, and neither of his 2 friends were eager to hike it with him. So, Nate, determined to do something different on this vacation, he decided he'd hike the trail alone. An hour later, wearing his Army-issued coveralls with 2 sweaters pulled over them and carrying a pocket full of peanuts to snack on, he headed up the mountain trail. He waved a cheerful farewell to his buddies and rounded the bend that officially marked the start of the well-used path. Hundreds of people use the trail in the summer, so he thought it wouldn't be too difficult to climb, even in the damp fog. And it would be good to get away from everyone and be able to make his own decisions for once. Just beyond the trailhead, Nate stopped to talk to a park ranger. He told the ranger where he was headed, and the ranger pointed out that it was not the best weather for climbing the mountain. Nate insisted he would be fine. The ranger told him if he got to the top, he would be welcome at the lodge at the end of the trail. Douglas Whiteside, a photographer, was spending the winter there and would love someone to chat with over hot coffee. Nate could hardly wait to get moving. There was someone to talk to about photography at the end of the trail. He munched a few peanuts as he started up the mountain. There were no forks in the path, and every turn was well marked, so the trail was easy to follow. He whistled as he walked along, happy that there was probably not another person between him and Douglas Whiteside. He hoped, though, that he'd soon climb above the low clouds and drizzle and feel the warmth of the sun on his face. But instead of getting above the low clouds, he entered more and more fog the higher he went. Still, he didn't think too much about it. He was on a well-defined trail, and he could always turn back if conditions got too bad. Besides, a single telephone wire was strung above the trail, and he felt sure it led right to the lodge where Douglas Whiteside was staying. It wasn't long before the misty drizzle turned to a steady rain, but Nate still didn't worry. He had on 2 sweaters and a woolen undershirt that kept out the rain. After he had been walking for a while, his muscles began to ache a little, so he walked backwards for a few minutes at a time to stretch them out. Upward he went, one army boot after the other. As he got higher up the trail, the rain turned to light snow, and before long the light snow gave way to heavy snow. Now, Nate was beginning to worry. He had no idea how far it was up to the lodge at the top, but the telephone wire was still running along overhead. As Nate walked on, he began making emergency plans in his mind. If he got too exhausted to go any farther, he could break the wire. When the rangers came to fix the problem, they would find him. Trouble was, if Nate had been thinking more clearly, he would have realized that the wire often broke in winter under the strain of the snow or ice or because of landslides. As a result, the rangers usually waited until spring before they would fix the broken wire. Nate trudged on. It was too late to go back, and he felt sure the lodge couldn't be far away now. The snow was already 6 inches deep, and it took all his effort to keep one foot moving in front of the other. After a while, he had to use his hands to help lift his legs with each step. He was shivering so hard now it was difficult to reach into his pocket for the peanuts, and after putting the peanuts in his mouth, it took all his effort to chew and swallow them. He had to stop every few minutes and rest. He would scoop up a handful of snow and stuff it into his mouth. As his body heat melted it, cold water trickled down the back of his throat. He looked around at the swirling whiteness that surrounded him and smiled to himself. One thing's for sure, he thought, I'll never die of thirst up here. He continued to walk, keeping his head down, concentrating on the trail. He could still make out the outline of the trail beneath the snow. He also kept a close lookout for signs of life. His feet were now damp and cold, and he was also having a difficult time feeling his toes. It was also becoming difficult to concentrate on the path in front of him. He was just about to flop down onto the snow from exhaustion when he noticed something. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. He wasn't seeing things. There really were footprints in the middle of the trail, and fresh footprints at that. They could only be Douglas Whiteside's footprints. The lodge had to be close by. Footprint by footprint, Nate placed his feet where Whiteside's feet must have trod no more than 5 minutes before. If it had been any longer than that, the snow would have covered the footprints over. As Nate trudged on, footprint after footprint, his mind began to tell him there was something strange about what he was doing. But what was it? He was so cold, he was having trouble thinking straight, and then it dawned on him. It was the shape of the prints. Douglas Whiteside would be wearing boots in weather like this, but the footprints Nate were following were bootless. Not only that, but the feet making the footprints were each about 7 inches wide. Nate fell to his feet and his knees and looked closer. The footprints he was following had been made by a huge bear. He had been following a bear up the mountain. There wasn't much he could do about it now. If there was a bear on the trail ahead of him, he'd just have to deal with the situation when he got to it. Right now, it was taking all his effort just to keep moving. He struggled on for about another 100 yards before the bear prints finally left the trail and headed toward a rocky ridge. Totally exhausted, Nate fell into the snow. His legs would no longer do what his brain told them to do. He felt sure he was going to die right there in the middle of the trail. He didn't fear dying. Instead, he felt angry. Angry at himself for getting into the trouble he was in. How could he have been so stupid, so careless? He thought back to the New Year's Eve service in Detroit, where he had dedicated himself to be a missionary. Now, because of his foolishness, He would never realize that dream. Instead, he had thrown his life away in a foolhardy hike up a mountain in bad weather. Sitting there thinking about the trouble he was in, Nate got so angry with himself that somehow he found the energy to get back on his feet and keep trudging. As he walked, he began doing something he should have done a lot earlier. He began to pray. He didn't plead with God or make any bargains like, if you just get me out of this mess, God, I'll do so and so. No, Nate had already committed his life to serve God as a missionary after he got out of the army. Instead, Nate thanked God for all the wonderful things he had done for him. As he prayed prayers of gratitude, a great feeling of peace came over him. In fact, he felt happy, and a broad smile spread across his face. After a while, though, despite the peace he felt inside, he became so exhausted that his mind went blank. Somehow his body kept moving. He became aware of dark shadows ahead of him. As he stumbled forward, the shadows became trees. He searched the sky above him for the phone wires. Finally, he spotted it running into the trees. With his eyes now fixed on the wire, he kept on going. Finally, the wire disappeared into a cabin. He'd made it, or had he? There was still another 100 yards to go to reach the cabin, and his body was too exhausted to go on. His legs buckled beneath him, and he slumped face down into the snow. His face was so numb he couldn't even feel the icy cold of the snow pressed against it. What a shame to walk so far and die within sight of help. The thought slowly crept across Nate's mind. After several minutes lying in the snow, he again found the energy to will his body to stand up and lurch forward. Stumbling footstep after footstep, he got closer and closer to the lodge, but before he reached the building, he had to stop twice more to gather his energy. At last, he fell against the door of the lodge. He called out. It was a pitiful, breathless call, but somehow it got Douglas Whiteside's attention. As a photographer swung the door open, warm air rushed against Nate's face. Nate pushed past Whiteside and collapsed onto the nearest chair. Douglas Whiteside was surprised at his unexpected guest, but he quickly sized up the situation. He poured some soup into a pan on the stove and dragged Nate to his bed and took off his wet clothes. Within an hour, Nate was fast asleep with hot soup warming his insides and a well-stoked fire heating his outsides. The next day, Nate told Douglas Whiteside all about his foolish trip. He wanted to head right back down the mountain, but Whiteside suggested he stay put for a while and get his strength back. This time, Nate took the advice. The following day, Douglas Whiteside walked down the trail with Nate. He made sure they were safely below the snow line before letting Nate walk the last few miles to the start of the trail alone. Nate had left his army buddies 2 days earlier, excited to be alone for a while. When he got back, he was very glad to see them again. He didn't even think about his lack of privacy as the three of them piled into their tent for the night. In fact, it was quite comforting to hear his buddies snoring away on either side of him. Nate pulled the sleeping bag around his shoulders and thought about the perilous trip up the mountain. How close he'd come to dying from cold and exposure. And it had happened because he'd been foolhardy. He had taken an unacceptable risk. He thought about flying. It was risky too, but it was an acceptable risk, like hiking the trail up to Glacier Point on a warm summer's day would be. In summer, the chances were good that you'd get all the way up there and back safely. If you took some precautions, packed some extra clothes and food, you could minimize the risk even more. Flying was like that. When you took off, there was a good chance you'd land safely, and if you were careful, thoroughly carried out your pre-flight safety checks and were sure of where you were headed, you minimized your risk of crashing. But if you were foolhardy and took unacceptable risks like flying in bad weather or neglecting safety and maintenance checks or making reckless maneuvers, you increased your chances of crashing. Seeing how close he'd come to throwing his life away because he had taken an unacceptable risk, Nate decided there and then that for the rest of his life he would strive to minimize the risk in the things he did, especially when flying. He would never again be foolhardy and ignore the advice of people who clearly knew better than he did about things. With that thought fixed firmly in his mind, Nate fell sound asleep.